Welcome to this evening's event, the opening event in C21's impressive schedule of events throughout the coming academic year. My name is Rick Gallardi, and I'm the Joseph Professor of Catholic Systematic Theology here at Boston College. Our presentation this evening is sponsored by both C21 and also the Boston College Theology Department. However, in this particular instance, this event is also connected to another significant event taking place this weekend out at the Connors Conference Center in Dover. This weekend, Boston College will be hosting a special symposium to honor the substantial theological contributions of the distinguished Dominican theologian, Professor Thomas O'Mara, whom I'll introduce a little bit later in the evening. Professor O'Mara's scholarly expertise has been remarkably wide-ranging. However, among his many contributions have been several important entries in the field of Catholic ecclesiology. And so the planners for the symposium thought it would be appropriate to honor Tom by convening a special symposium in which we invite 40 of North America's most distinguished scholars on the theology of the Church to gather for a weekend in order to reflect on the state of Catholic ecclesiology and to consider the most pressing questions that lie before us. And that symposium will begin tomorrow evening out at Dover. Although that symposium is not open to the public, we did want to share something of the conversation that we hope will transpire this weekend and make that available to the larger community. One of the papers that we will be discussing this weekend will be given by Professor Natalia Imperatori-Lee. And so we have asked her to give an alternative presentation, not at all the same as the one she'll be doing this weekend, as part of the C21 series. And I do want to say just a word about that. I had the great fortune a little over a year ago of being the president-elect of the Catholic Theological Society of America, and I helped plan our convention that year, which was on the theme of conversion. And one of our plenary speakers was the Australian theologian, Professor Ormond Rush. And I asked Natalia if she would give a brief response to Orm's plenary address, which she did quite eloquently, a very succinct 10-minute response, after which she sat down and Orm and I both turned to her and said, "You have got to develop what you just said tonight." 14 months later, you get to hear what she developed from what we heard 14 months ago. Professor Natalia Imperatori-Lee is currently an associate professor of religious studies at Manhattan College in Riverdale, New York. She teaches in the areas of contemporary Catholicism, U.S. Latina theology, and gender studies. She holds a PhD in systematic theology from the University of Notre Dame. Her research area is in contemporary ecclesiology, including the impact of U.S. Latinos and Latinas on the North American ecclesial landscape. She has published numerous articles and is currently working on a book for Orbis Press on the importance of narrative in Catholic ecclesiology. This evening, she will share some reflections, which will be followed by a response by Professor O'Mara, who I will introduce at that time. Her reflections are offered under the title, Facing the Invisible, the Role of the Marginalized in Ecclesial Reform. Please join me in welcoming Professor Imperatori-Lee.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rick, for that introduction and also for the invitation. I'd like to thank the Church in the 21st Century Center here at Boston College for their generous welcome and hospitality, even despite my BA from Fordham, and my allegiance to the New York Yankees, and my even more scandalous roots at the University of Notre Dame. I'm especially grateful to Tom O'Mara for agreeing to respond to my remarks tonight, and in general for his wisdom. I never was lucky enough to take a class with Tom at Notre Dame, but my spouse did. And Tom's wisdom is something I hear Michael drop here and there to our sons pretty regularly. His favorite is this summary of Aquinas: birds gotta fly, fish gotta swim. Anyone who's a student of Tom's knows that one. We hear that a lot. Why can't I do this? Well, you just can't. Why not? Birds got to fly, fish got to swim. It's very effective. As Rick mentioned, the title of my remarks this evening is Facing the Invisible, the Role of the Marginalized in Ecclesial Reform. It's not lost on me that I'm facing the non-marginalized, not you, them, even as I talk about this. It sounds a bit like an oxymoron. After all, where do we face if we're trying to face the invisible? Nevertheless, today I invite you to reflect with me on what it means to have a face and what it means to show a face to the world. And also, I would invite us to consider which persons, groups, or constituencies have been rendered invisible by our society and by our church, both here in the United States and globally. After some reflection on the reality and the distortion of the face, I will home in on two exemplary realities: the story of American Catholicism as a local example, and the problem of the sensus fidelium as a global example. Animating my remarks is the overarching question for the evening. What should we do if we are to become a church whose face is resplendent with the light of Christ, as the Second Vatican Council wanted? Our faces are the most visible and the most naked part of our bodies. They are a primary way in which we interact with the world and with one another in relationship. The face is intimate, even as it remains constantly exposed. It is rarely fully covered, and even the practice of veiling points to the powerful intimacy of the face. Though we may embellish our faces with makeup, or with paltry attempts at putting on a good face, or vow al mal tiempo buena cara, which is something that was said a lot in my family, the face is a locus of disclosure. Our faces reveal our emotions, our moods, our age, our confusion or understanding, our empathy or our hardness of heart. Much of our humanity resides there in our faces. This confers power on the face-to-face encounter. Think of the meaningfulness of eye contact with a child, or a lover, or an enemy, or, as in the thought of Emmanuel Levinas, the face-to-face encounter with the other that brings us into subjectivity. A few months ago, I ran across an article in The Atlantic about selfies. Do we all know what those are? We just took one. Certainly, if you have teenagers or tweens or children with access to any sort of electronic device that has a camera attached to it, you know what a selfie is. It's a picture that you take of yourself with some sort of electronic device. This piece in The Atlantic explored how selfies look strange to the subject who takes it, especially if the photo is taken on a phone. Most of us react quite negatively when we first see our self-shot photo. And this is true also when you hear your voice on a recording for the first time. When we look at ourselves in the selfie, our face appears foreign, strange, ugly, or at the very least, different. This is because most photo applications on a phone reverse the image. That is, the selfie depicts the face we show to the world. Why then is it so foreign? The answer has to do with the asymmetry of our faces, right? There are very slight and sometimes very obvious differences between the right and left hemispheres of our face, right? You might have a freckle over here that you don't have over here, or your nose tilts a little to one side, or one eye is bigger than the other. And those things seem out of place when we see an image in reverse. We have an odd but pervasive familiarity with a mirror image of our face, which is the inverse of the face that the world sees. According to one expert, quote, "The interesting thing is that people don't really know what they look like. The image you have of yourself in your mind is not quite the same as what actually exists." Remarkably, when presented with both images, participants in a 1977 study preferred their mirror image, while their friends and romantic partners preferred their true or external image. We have here a rather commonplace example of the phenomenon described by Levinas. our inability to self-actualize outside of a relationship with an other. We do not even know our own true faces, only reflections, but our actual faces are known and loved in relationship. The question of how we establish those relationships, of course, remains open. And here, another aspect of the article is helpful. The main reason we dislike our selfies is precisely this lack of familiarity. And I'm quoting from the article here. We see ourselves in the mirror all the time. You brush your teeth, you shave, you put on makeup. Looking at yourself in the mirror becomes a firm impression. You have that familiarity. Familiarity breeds liking. You've established a preference for that look of your face. That seems pretty basic, right? Familiarity breeds liking. We know that we prefer the comfortable and the familiar and the usual, and we turn away from novelty. This isn't necessarily bad, but it can trap us in an insular loop, tempting us with narcissism and selfishness, or more dangerously, androcentrism, racism, other forms of social sin. The phenomenon of the unfamiliar or ugly selfie tells us something about how we need the other to know ourselves. We are truly known only in relationship. We cannot even ever see ourselves as the world sees us, and the me with which I'm most familiar belongs only to me. The me that I share is foreign to me. My face, with which I am so familiar, the person I see and make up and talk to in the mirror, I'm sure everybody does that, the me in my mind's eye is not even the me that others see. That me is inaccessible to me. So our faces, which are uniquely us, are not uniquely ours, or even remotely ours. My face, as it is known only in relationship. This gives new understanding, I think, to the notion of God as love, to the Trinity as God in relationship, to Emmanuel as God with us. But it is not only our self that is truly revealed in relationship. Our humanity, too, depends on the other, on community. What could it mean for Catholicism and for the Church that even our faces do not belong to us? We experience them intimately, after all, what is more familiar than your own face? But that closed-in experience, me and my own face, is a false one, a false consciousness. Our self-image is distorted, like that selfie. The face we know is not the face we show. There's a gap there. It's interesting then that 50 years ago, the Second Vatican Council noted an analogous gap in its writings on the Church. The first paragraph of Lumen Gentium claims that, quote, the light of Christ is resplendent on the face of the Church, end quote. But later in the document, the bishops acknowledge that the Church is at once holy and in need of purification, so that, quote, the sign of Christ may shine more brightly over the face of the Church. Thus, even the bishops at Vatican II acknowledge that the light of Christ is not quite as resplendent on the face of the Church as it might be. Gaudium et Spes elaborates on the gap between the face of the Church and the light of Christ, identifying believers, Christians, as the reason for the non-belief of some, because these believers, quote, fail to reveal the genuine face of God. In these passages, the Council allows for talk of ecclesial sin. And today I want to focus on a particular kind of ecclesial sin, the sin of rendering the other invisible. The work of Emmanuel Levinas on the face and on the power of face-to-face encounter illuminates some ways in which the Church might overcome the gap between the light of Christ and the face of the Church, though of course the convergence of these two will only be fully realized in the eschaton. Nevertheless, the plan for reform set out by the bishops at the Council included this resplendence as a goal, and the work of Levinas, a Jewish philosopher, provides key insights in moving toward it. For Levinas, the face of the other, quote, denudes, undresses, and disarms the subject, end quote. And the face-to-face encounter with the other exacts a demand on the subject to enter into relationship with that other, an uneasy relationship, where the subject must care for the other in non-totalizing ways, including through gestures of justice, generosity, and sacrifice. Ultimately, the ethical demand of the face-to-face encounter with the other is a kenotic one. inviting the subject to divest itself of prestige and power in favor of a posture of seeking justice. In addition to facing the fact of the sin in and of and by the church, I would invite us as a church to face the demographic reality of the church. This includes the pull of the global south, that, though somewhat reflected in the Argentine-Italian Pope, has yet to be reflected in the hierarchy and the power structure of the church, and even in the theological academy. It also must include the racial and ethnic reality of the soon-to-be majority of American Catholics who are Latino and Latina, and how this reality stands in contrast, sometimes silently or invisibly, to the way the story of American Catholicism is told, originating from the Northeast and expanding west and south. I know, right? The sins of commission and omission, of invisibility making, are rampant in this arena. And we must face this failure with honesty, compassion, repentance, and forgiveness. But most importantly, we must face this reality with a posture of listening. So now I want to move to the problem of American Catholicism. In making the other invisible, especially the racial or ethnic other in the US church, American Catholicism has become ignorant of its own face. Our history, pastoral praxis, ecclesiology has rendered some groups invisible, unseen, and silenced. Because of this, our ecclesial selfie has turned out to be problematic. Let me give you an example. Ecclesial selfie, right? That's a good one. Someone liked it. For years, scholars of Latino and Latina Catholicism have emphasized the existence of non-immigrant Hispanic Catholicism in the United States. These communities, concentrated in the South and the West, are about contemporaneous with the 13 colonies and certainly provide a different timeline of the arrival of Catholicism in what is now the continental United States. However, the conversation about Latino and Latina Catholics in the US is framed in a way that tends to highlight the novelty of this demographic reality, its newness and newfound urgency. To be sure, the demographic shift in the US church means that a majority of Catholics will be of some sort of Latino origin in the very near future, and this demographic majority is a novelty, but the perduring presence of Hispanic Catholicism is not. Why then do we conceive, and I've done this too, of Catholicism primarily as an immigrant phenomenon, with entry points mostly in the Northeast and spreading south and west, impelled by some version of manifest destiny? What about those Catholic communities encountered by westward moving pioneers? In truth, there have always been Catholic communities in this country that do not fit this immigrant model, where a group comes to the United States as poor immigrants or refugees and in a generation or two has achieved upward mobility and cultural assimilation. Non-immigrant Hispanic Catholicism is only one example, but a useful one when we think about the face of the American church, both the face we ecclesiologists see when we examine it and the face as it really is. The enduring presence of Hispanic Catholicism in the United States, seated in these non-immigrant communities, but of course fed and renewed by a consistent stream of immigration throughout the country, also highlights the need for US Catholicism to enter into relationship with an other, the other that has been rendered invisible in our midst. In this face-to-face encounter, the church can come to know itself as a reality characterized more fully by unity and diversity, rather than uniformity, and in so doing, come closer to reflecting the light of Christ. Instead of characterizing American Catholicism strictly as an immigrant phenomenon, with the attendant expectations regarding assimilation and upward mobility, why not speak of a multi-source theory of American Catholicism that takes a hemispheric perspective, as Timothy Mattavina has recently suggested? This would acknowledge not only the reality of the past, the existence of those Hispanic Catholic communities that were absorbed by the US in the colonial expansion, but would also bring the enduring ties that between the United States and Latin America to the fore. Latino Catholicism's deep roots in what is now the continental US continue to exert an influence, in part because of continued migration, and also because globalization and ease of travel and communication has made ties with home countries harder to break and more enduring. So you no longer have this phenomenon like the Italians getting on a boat and never going back, right? People are in constant contact, and that makes a difference. Moreover, in defiance of the immigrant paradigm, some of these groups might not assimilate completely, and certainly might not assimilate on the timeline that European Catholics of earlier centuries did. The question of upward mobility can be answered similarly. Latino Catholics remain poor, at risk for low rates of educational attainment, high rates of teen pregnancy, and on and on and on. Though Latino Catholicism is itself an amalgamation of cultures from the Rio Grande to the Tierra del Fuego, theologians have highlighted some important differences with the more dominant face of American or Northern European, or if I dare say it in this room, Irish Catholicism. Very nervous. Among these ties that make Hispanic Catholicism differ from that Northern European Catholicism are looser ties to the parish structure, for example, or increased prevalence and variety of home-based devotions, which are more often woman-led or lay-led, and some anti-clerical strains owing to the allegiance between the Spanish crown and the church. These are merely some characteristics of some strains of Catholicism that exist and have existed in the US for some time, in some cases as long as the US has existed, and that are practiced by the demographic group on the cusp of becoming the majority of the Roman Catholic Church here in this country. My point here is not to warn the so-called dominant culture of the impending Latino revolution. You don't have to be scared. Instead, what this analysis points out is that multiple legitimate varieties of Catholicism exist and have existed in the United States for generations. The American Church is, as Matavina notes, the most ethnically and racially diverse ecclesial body in the world. But it is also one where the plurality of Catholic practices and beliefs, differing according to language and culture and custom, have flourished despite being rendered invisible by dominant groups. If Catholicism in this country weren't primarily Northern European or Irish, but instead a tapestry of Catholicisms that originated throughout the country at different times and is reinforced by a continued migration, the significance of Latino and Latina Catholicism would no longer be reduced to a new issue that needs to be addressed, but instead would be recognized as a key component in American religious history. Taking this hemispheric view, as Matavina suggests, means taking into account that our experience of Catholicism is merely one of many legitimate Catholic expressions worldwide, and that the American Catholicism we sometimes theorize about, and again I do this too, is better characterized as the Northern European variety of American Catholicism, focused on Irish or German or other European norms, models, and expressions. The hemispheric view does more than merely acknowledge the legitimate variety of Catholic expressions that exist, and I will say it again, have almost always existed in this country. This approach recognizes the historical, economic, and political ties between the US and Latin America, ties that continue to characterize and complicate our political and religious lives. American Catholicism is a phenomenon characterized by pluralism. In this country, we are a church that could exhibit, on a local or national level, the reality of unity and uniformity that is a mark of the global church. This plurality of Catholicisms, this plurality of praxis, rather than being symptomatic of a lack of discipline or a confused faithful, might just be the real face of the real church. We should ask ourselves why we find it so jarring to look at. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about kenosis. Of course, we can only come to know this plurality, this genuine, legitimate diversity of Catholicism, in encounter with the other. Time and again in this short pontificate, Pope Francis has said that the Church should embrace a culture of encounter. Certainly far more than a dictatorship of relativism or the dichotomy of the culture of life, culture of death, we hear from this Pope the word encounter and the necessity of encounter with the other. He embodies it, too, in a variety of ways. Most recently, just this week, in that interreligious soccer match. That was an encounter. Here, too, the insights of Levinas prove useful. In particular, Levinas set out many preconditions for a legitimate encounter with the other. Although our subjectivity depends on it, it is crucial that encounter with the other not be undertaken in service of myself or my own actualization. Instead, it was empathy with the suffering other that compelled the face-to-face encounter. Thus, Levinas wants to assure us that the encounter with the other is undertaken kenotically, with a self-emptying posture. He talks about gestures of generosity and sacrifice in the service of justice. The ethical demand placed on me by witnessing the suffering of the other, this is what impels the encounter. I cannot not be moved. Not moved to help or to fix, but to care for the other in non-totalizing ways. Kenotic, self-emptying relationship is critical to the church in the third millennium. The existence of plurality in our local experience of Catholicism can be difficult to discern in some parishes. Increasingly, we surround ourselves with mirrors, Ecclesial-Lee, just as we do in other aspects of our lives. And I always think of the Justin Timberlake song here, right? Why is there a love song that's called Mirrors, about reflecting me back to me? Is that what love is? I hope not. Well, we watch the shows we like. Sometimes we skip the commercials we dislike. We get the news from the sources we like. We surround ourselves with the people we like and the towns we like. And we go to churches with preaching, music, or liturgy that we like. In doing this, we breed the sort of narcissistic familiarity that the selfie article exposes, ironically, since selfies are so narcissistic in origin anyway. Those spaces become our mirror image with which we become so comfortable. But as we recall, these are a distortion of reality. By contrast, the plurality of American Catholicism, and global Catholicism by extension, can be seen pretty readily in any urban parish, and increasingly in any suburban parish that is dealing with blending ethnic and racial communities and worship styles. Remember, Levinas envisioned the encounter with the other to be an unsettling one, and the resulting relationship to be an uneasy one. A variety of models can and have been used to approach these sorts of uneasy parish relationships, and I'm sure you all have experiences of these. There's the blended parish, right, where multiple constituencies forge a new parish reality that is multilingual but worshiping together, pooling finances, and sharing governance. There's also the two-parish model, where ethnic or linguistic differences mandate a separation between communities, with each group having their own worship times and possibly sharing physical space. Sometimes it's like the main sanctuary and the basement church, and they don't share much else. Other models exist too, but I just want to highlight the ways in which we are already dealing with plurality. Although in US Catholicism it can be difficult for dominant groups to see themselves as one among many, but as one piece of an increasingly complex reality and not even the biggest piece. If we're truly to move forward with this task of face-to-face encounter with the other, to gloss a biblical phrase, plurality must increase and uniformity must decrease. So now let's talk a little bit about the sensus fidelium. Face-to-face encounter is humbling, and it should be. The challenge of caring for the other in non-totalizing ways means resisting the urge to subsume difference for the sake of predictability or ease. Anyone who's raised children knows this is true. The hemispheric approach to Catholicism codifies this by allowing for alternatives to the model of immigration assimilation that is increasingly obsolete in Hispanic Catholic parish groups. This approach to Catholic history allows us to find unity and diversity in our local realities, and that represents an important start in the work of relating to the other. The hemispheric model forces us to zoom out, providing a perspective that relativizes the overall significance of one group or ethnicity or race or city to the reality of American Catholicism, and instead reveals a rich tapestry, a healthy chopped salad, a polygon, or whatever your preferred image is of unity and diversity. But this zoomed out perspective on the church in our own hemisphere is only a start. The global church, too, the church on a macro level, needs mechanisms for facilitating face-to-face encounter, particularly between groups where there is a significant power differential. To implement Levinas's model of encounter with the other ecclesially, globally, we must first identify who has been made invisible in the global church. We know that Pope Francis has called for encounter, but it's up to us to delineate how to go about it. If the church were to embody this model somehow, to genuinely have a face-to-face encounter, how would it do that? In terms of the church ad intra, which was a main focal point of reform for the council, particularly in Lumen Gentium, A fruitful face-to-face encounter might take place between different constituencies in the church. For example, the magisterium, theologians, people in the pews. If there were to be a sort of perichoresis of the insights of these three communities, the hierarchical magisterium, theological insight, and the sensus fidelium, what would it look like? My hope, and the council's, is that there would be a genuine face-to-face encounter within the church of these three realities. But in effect, we leave that encounter to chance. Or more realistically, we have relegated it to an eschatological hope. We talk about the sensus fidelium a great deal, but we lack avenues through which we might hear this infallible witness of the faithful. While it is true, as Orlando Espín reminds us, that the sensus fidelium is an intuition, and intuitions require interpretation, the sensus fidelium further requires avenues for expression, and authentic dialogue also requires structures that don't presently exist. My question isn't merely what mechanisms exist through which the sensus fidelium is expressed. We can think of lots of those, right? Art, literature, music, practice. Those are all great expressions of the sensus fidelium. More importantly, what I'm asking is, do mechanisms for the reception of the sensus fidelium exist at all? I tend to think no. If there were mechanisms for listening, perhaps the church would look different. Maybe theology would be less often viewed with suspicion by the hierarchy. Maybe women's experience beyond motherhood would be taken into account in discussions of baptismal dignity and full humanity. Where are the venues for face-to-face encounter between the hierarchy and the laity, where the laity speak and the power structure listens canonically? Moreover, who is listening to the sensus fidelium on racism, or sexism, or heterosexism, or transphobia? Interestingly, Latino Catholicism has been described as having a matriarchal core, but even this falls short, right? Relegating women once again to maternal metaphors, instead of the rich diversity of human experience that belongs to women as thinkers, as innovators, as well as truncating the experience of men. What about men's experience of parenthood and marriage? These realities, which are continually shifting in our society, must be something the church is attuned to, because these experiences have been rendered invisible by our action and our inaction. We must face them. These marginalized realities serve as the other, which constitutes the church as a subject, to use Levinas's language. We all know the church's failings when it comes to this justice-seeking posture, that the church has turned away from the others in its midst, or worse, dismissed or erased the other in totalizing, colonizing ways. The church is indeed sinful, and as many scholars have noted, its sinfulness goes beyond the sins of individuals. The patriarchy, racism, colonialism, homophobia remains embedded in the structure and thought patterns of the church. Our history is littered with it. It is inescapable for us, and we must face that reality. And perhaps more importantly, we must allow that reality to speak to us and listen canonically. We must care for that reality in non-totalizing ways. Many believe that the election of a Latin American pope would remedy the problem of the Eurocentric hierarchy and the Eurocentric vision that pervades the church. And maybe it will. The young pontificate has shown promise, I think, right? But the fact of the sin is not erased by the face of the pope. If anything, this pope might begin to indicate ways in which we can face the sins of the church, and I think he's doing that. But above all, my hope is that the face-to-face encounter with the others in our midst, in the church and in the academy as well, will not be carried out with the intent to dominate or educate, or the worst, prevent or avoid the confusion of the faithful. God. Instead, that's the worst one. Instead, the listening should be kenotic, and it should be focused on the lay poor, who have always been and continue to be the majority of the global Catholic Church. What would a gesture of justice look like between the hierarchy and the lay poor? Or between the hierarchy and lay women, if we were to choose one silenced or marginalized group? What would non-totalizing care consist in? And what subjectivity would result? So let me conclude. The face of the church is not yet resplendent with the light of Christ. If we take a snapshot of the church, locally and globally, and stare at it, would we like what we see? Or would we find that we've become enamored of our mirror images and embarrassed by our true faces? The insights of Levinas help us to identify appropriate ways of moving toward a church that is resplendent with the light of Christ. This involves face-to-face encounter with the others in our midst. The two examples I've shared, Hispanic or Latino Catholicism for the U.S. Church and the Sensus Fidelium for the global church, are just two ways in which this encounter might occur. In fact, I suspect that living the Christian life necessitates a multiplicity of these kenotic encounters, of seeking out the silences, the invisible, and staring right at them, being made uneasy, entering into that uneasy relationship, and in doing so, becoming more human. Tom O'Mara, as a dissertation director and graduate advisor, encouraged many of his students to travel, and I know he'd encouraged some people in this room to do that. He did this with the intent of having his students see Catholicism at work all over the world. In mandating this, O'Mara shared a most important insight with his students, wisdom we as a church have yet to learn and affirm. Face-to-face encounter builds relationship. It breaks us out of old familiarities and breeds newer, wider awareness. It hears and faces the other. It makes us more human. And in doing these things, makes the light of Christ, the face of God, to shine more brightly on the face of the church and in the world at large. Thank you.
Natalia, thank you so much for some remarkably eloquent and challenging reflections for all of us. If you will permit me, I'd also like to offer an introduction now for the respondent and the subject of our celebration for our symposium this weekend. Professor Thomas O'Mara is the Warren Professor of Theology Emeritus of the University of Notre Dame. He is a member of the Order of Preachers, and he did his doctoral studies in Munich, Germany, at Ludwig Maximilian Universität, where he studied under Heinrich Fries and Karl Rahner. After a brief time teaching in an ecumenical context in Dubuque, Iowa, actually a brief time, I think it was over a decade, wasn't it, Tom? Yeah, not so brief time, teaching in Dubuque, O'Mara took a teaching appointment, accepted a teaching appointment at the University of Notre Dame, where he would remain until his retirement. During his long and distinguished tenure there, O'Mara became an internationally respected scholar, publishing major books on St. Thomas Aquinas, Erich Przywara, Karl Rahner, 19th century German Catholic thought, Christian fundamentalism, theologies of ministry, and even on the theological significance of the potential existence of extraterrestrials. He is a past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America and a recipient of its most distinguished award for lifetime achievement in the field of theology, the John Courtney Murray Award. We are privileged to be able to honor him this weekend and to have him serve as a respondent to Professor Imperatori-Lee's thoughtful and challenging reflections. Please join me in welcoming Professor Thomas O'Mara.
Thank you, Professor Gallardi. The list of the movies, the list of the books that I've written, the movie rights are almost all still available. I had a view that Brad Pitt would star as Karl Rahner, but that hasn't been fulfilled yet. It's a very great pleasure for me to be back in Boston at Boston College. 6 or 7 years ago, I had the pleasure of being a visiting professor here. And earlier, in 1970-71, I taught at Weston when it moved into Cambridge, which is now the School of Theology and Ministry, in very exciting years with wonderful colleagues. It's a particular pleasure for me to respond to Professor Imperatori, who I knew when she was a student of theology and now through her career, which is still at its beginnings. Professor Imperatori's work and specialization is important because it's ecclesiology, the theology of the church. And as we heard tonight, she represents something new in terms of ideas. I thought that her image of the face was significant and captivating and valuable. When I was, as some of the students here, when I was in college, the age of 20 or so, 55 years ago, I think the popular image of a Catholic would indeed have been of a face, but it was a face withdrawn. It was the face of a solitary person in a dim church, motionless, alone, with their face somewhat hidden in their hands, praying for something, forgiveness. As Professor Imperatori has told us, that image and all of our images have in recent years and decades been liberated in order to see and to be seen. So she has a beautiful phrase when she says that the face of a man or a woman is, quote, a locus of disclosure. Our faces indeed reveal our emotions, our moods, our confusion or understanding, our empathy or our rejection. We Christians believe that the human face flows from being the image of God and from us being the brothers and sisters of the risen Christ. Life is a struggle for our faces to disclose ourselves honestly and also to disclose God's plan for us. And as the lecturer pointed out, our face shines or looks puzzled in the faces of other people and amid communities. In terms of the Catholic Church, the church worldwide, and of all the churches in the United States, they are all struggling today to overcome the phrase she used several times, to overcome the gap between the light of Christ and the face of the church. I can only underline the important insights that Professor Imperatori has offered us this evening, particularly, of course, at first, her new model and the process at work in the United States Church. The Latina churches are large and new, as she pointed out. But what we may not have thought about until this evening is they are new in a sociological and historical way, and they are not going to follow totally the older traditional model of the new waves of immigrants with the accompanying expectations regarding assimilation and upward mobility. Rather than see, as we have pretty much, and we've seen it repeat itself many times, the immigrant process is aligned with stages, we should see that the local churches in the United States have their own histories and offer perhaps their own models. They don't have to be identified with the model of Catholicism that has pretty much determined all the ethnic groups as they come into the United States. She says there's a multi-source theory of American Catholicism with a hemispheric perspective. And interestingly to hear that there's a great variety of cultures in American Catholicism that come from the worlds reaching from the Rio Grande to Tierra del Fuego. The linguistic, social, and financial stages of the ethnic past are yielding or have yielded to something new. In the Midwest, it would be pretty hard to find a city of over 40,000 that does not have a German and an Irish parish right next to it, or several twin groups like that. They are distinguished by a 100-year history before 1970 of never having any contact with each other. So we have also a history in the United States of excluding the other's faces, and Professor Imperatori alludes to that. So we are at the edge of seeing that there is going to be different models of the church coming into us, and that we are asked to be receptive to this for two reasons, as she mentioned. First of all, this new model will help us to have local churches that are vital and are also diverse. So we would learn in a profound way that there should be a variety of models in parishes and dioceses. Structures are very important, and structures will change. That's the underlying message of this evening, too. Face-to-face encounters are important because they're the prelude to changing the structures and the prelude to facing a kind of poverty or discrimination or clericalism which exists far too widespread. Face-to-face encounter helps us to welcome the faces, but then also to see them as becoming active in parish life, in evangelization, in service. The result begins with welcoming the face in the other, but that's only the prelude so that the Holy Spirit can pour its gifts into all the baptized and not into a very small percentage. And this creates parishes that are vital and attractive and that have expansion and service. Along with this expansion and variety, along with the new model, is also, at the end of the lecture, a newer role for Catholics in thinking about their faith and teaching. Actually, we're 50 years into a remarkable period in American Catholicism of theological education. More and more Catholics are educated in theology. There's more and more journals. There's more and more theological programs and institutes. It's simply almost an infinite number of theological opportunities. And we are now 50 years into that, but as Professor Imperatori pointed out, we also have the problem that much of that energy, or at least some of that energy and some of that potential, is excluded. So the faces of the theologians, the faces of the lay ecclesial ministers, the faces of the parents, the faces of people who are educated and reflect on their faith, which is more and more American Catholics, those faces are invisible. She has presented to us what is a structural problem. The phrase sens fidele or sensus fidelium, that has a long tradition supporting the fact that the baptized believer has a right to articulate the faith. But beyond that today, we have something new that her paper points out, and that is we have a huge structural and organizational problem because the leaders of the church simply do not want to avert, not much less to listen, they don't want to avert to the fact that you have a large number of people who are educated, and you have a large number of people who are in theology or who are teaching, and also you have a theology that once you're a believer, of course you have a right to think about your faith and indeed to express it. So she has pointed out what might be the biggest problem in the church, and that is, how do you have structures which preserve authority roles for bishops and popes, but who don't have any non-people, people without voices or without faces, but simply have all the baptized who are increasingly educated and increasingly active in the ministry. Before I conclude, let me point out that we have on the podium, from my old point of view, the example of this. Again, When I was ordained to the priesthood, and I was not ordained by Saints Peter and Paul or Thomas Aquinas, when I was ordained to the priesthood, in the entire world, there was no way for a Catholic to study theology unless he was a seminarian. There was no school. For America, the first would begin by Sister Natalia at St. Mary's across from Notre Dame. So not only no woman could study theology, no layperson could study theology. So in 40 years or so, we have reached this extraordinary fullness and plethora of people who are teaching theology and studying theology. It's an extraordinary revolution. But the plethora of this, exemplified in Professor Gallardi and Imperatori, the plethora is in a way so great and so successful that it's, by church authority, it's ever more isolated. So that there's a sense in which measures are taken to exclude this and suppress this. So what she's describing by the venerable phrase of the sense of the faithful is a structural organizational problem by which the person who is a thinking human being and a believing Christian is going to be told face to face that it's okay for them to say something. So theologians today are saying that everybody in the church both teaches and learns. And also, it's not enough to be ordained. You also have to be informed and educated. In the future, every Catholic, like all of us, will have to think and learn, and everyone will be teaching in this high educational society to some degree. So these insights this afternoon, we thank you, and we should take them away for us. They'll motivate our contribution to helping the local church, the parish, and the diocese be more active. They will also help us in our own lives with the many changes that will inevitably come to the church in the future. For although we may be surprised by the rate of change in the Catholic Church, or we may be impatient about it, one thing is certainly sure. Change will continue in the church for a long time. And these insights that you've given us, Natalia, will help us to understand why in the coming years the church in the United States is the way it is, and not to be afraid of that. And it will also teach us how to help it struggle to be much more. Thank you.